on to Dr. Paul Sheard. As I mentioned, he's an economist and research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. I also just count him as a really good friend of the Hong Kong Association of New York, and he's helping out on a regular basis. And when we used to meet in person, he was always there at our good events, and hopefully we'll be again soon when we continue with those. So Paul, I hand it over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Don, and welcome everybody to the webinar today. So let me sort of approach this topic playing to my sort of expertise, which is more on the sort of the macro side. And I think with Damien and Alice, we'll get into the sort of supply chain issues at a more sort of micro level. But let me give you the sort of the bird's eye view from the sort of macroeconomist perspective. And Candy has already given some numbers. As it happened, actually, good timing, the April CPI report came out for the US, came out today. The number for April year on year was 8.3% CPI inflation. So that ticked down a little bit from the 8.5% that was there in March, but it was above expectation. There is a bit of a favorable base effect to inflation because COVID really hit, if you remember, March, April 2020. That initially forced inflation down, but a year later, as the economy recovered, it sort of went up more than you would expect. And now we're in the next phase of that cycle with a base effect from April onwards, which is favorable for bringing inflation down. But you know, it's got a long way to come down from 8.5% peak in March. So what's going on here? Obviously, among economists and policymakers and central bankers, you know, a lot of people are scratching their heads and debating, you know, how to understand this, because this was not forecast by very many economists. You know, yours truly included, but if you look at the Fed, for example, the Fed makes forecasts every quarter of inflation, GDP, its own federal funds rate, interest rate, sort of 1-2 years out, 1-2-3 years out. And they spent all of 2021 just chasing inflation, and they've done the same thing in 2022. Every time they issue these forecasts, they have to kind of raise their inflation forecast, really kind of chasing the inflation numbers. So at a very simple level, if we have generalized inflation, that is the overall price level, the CPI, is rising at 5, 6, 7, now 8%. Anybody who's done any basic economics would say, well, it must be that there's too much demand relative to supply. That almost follows definitionally: too much money, too much purchasing power, too much demand, chasing not enough goods. And what happens is prices start going up, relative prices shift, but they're all going up sort of together. And in fact, if you look at the CPI report in the US that I mentioned, since November of last year, there's an interesting phenomenon, which is that every subcomponent of the CPI is in positive territory, and some of them are very big. Energy's up 30% year on year. Food's up 9%. But what you typically see, Don, when you look at a CPI report in normal times, is some things are going up, other things are going down, and they kind of, to a large extent, cancel out, so that you end up with this nice kind of 2% inflation. What's different about this episode is kind of everything's going up. It's just that some things are going up more than others. Now, you know, a lot of people are saying, well, I mean, too much demand relative to too little supply. Why would that be? Well, it must be because of all this government spending that's taken place. It must be because of all this money that's been printed. And, you know, there's an element of that, but I'll sort of push back against that to a significant degree. It's a little bit misleading, that story. Let me explain why. Well, federal debt, if you look at the total debt of the federal government in the US, and I'll stick mainly to the US, but you know, we could tell a similar story in Europe in particular, to a lesser extent in Japan, has gone up from about $17 trillion pre-crisis, pre-COVID, that is, to about 23 now. So that's up about $6 trillion. That's about a quarter of GDP. So that's a lot of debt to be added to the system in a couple of years. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve has taken its balance sheet pre-COVID was about $4.3 trillion. Now it is $8.9 trillion. So it's increased by about, the Fed has pumped up its balance sheet through this so-called quantitative easing by about $4.6 trillion. Again, a very big number. If you went back to the financial crisis, the Fed's balance sheet then, 2008, was less than 1 trillion. So in this 2-year period, they've added to their balance sheet, almost 5 times the size of their balance sheet back in the financial crisis. So, these numbers are kind of off the charts. So you would sort of say, well, wow, that must be the driver of this runaway or very high inflation. And I would say, hold on a minute. You've got to look at the context. And if you go back to COVID in March or second quarter of 2020, the initial effect of the lockdowns was, of course, a dramatic negative shock to economic activity, to GDP. And the numbers that we saw in the first half of 2020, particularly the second quarter, we have never seen numbers like this before. I cannot emphasize how dramatic a negative shock. It put the global financial crisis and the Great Recession to shame. I'll give you one statistic. The unemployment rate in the US went up from 3.5% in February 2020 to 14.7% in April, 2 months later. So 11 percentage points, something like 22 million jobs were lost just in those 2 months. If you go back to the financial crisis, again, it's the Great Recession. The unemployment rate in the US went up from pre-crisis 6.1%, reached a peak of 10%. So it went up about 4 percentage points. That took 14 months. This time, 11 percentage points in 2 months. So the economy was really falling off a cliff into our first half of 2020. And that was a context in which governments around the world spilt a lot of fiscal ink. Essentially, they created a lot of money, and they transferred to households, to companies, to kind of keep the economies in suspended animation so that they could resume growth and resume economic activity when the COVID shock passed. And that's exactly what happened. So, we could argue about, well, didn't they go overboard? I think particularly the American Rescue Plan that came in at the beginning of the Biden administration, in retrospect, probably was not needed anywhere near on that scale. So yes, we can have the debates about the appropriateness of the size and content of the fiscal and monetary stimulus. But I would argue very strongly that the main story was on the supply side of the economy. And particularly the labor market and supply chains, which the other panelists will talk about in more detail. And of course, those two things are connected, because one of the major reasons that supply chains have become so dislocated and such bottlenecks have developed in supply chains is that there have been labor shortages, and the labor market has been quite dysfunctional or damaged by COVID. Now, the unemployment rate is back to 3.6%. So I mentioned before, it went up to 14.7% in the US. It's back to basically where it was, a very low level before the COVID hit. Job offers are running at around about 11.5 million. Well, pre-COVID, that number was around about 6 million. So the labor market is very hot. But there are about 4 million workers missing. For example, if you look at the number of people in the US who are not in the labor force, that number pre-COVID was 95 million. So these are people who've retired, they've dropped out of the workforce. They may just not be in the workforce for various reasons. 95 million. That number is now almost 100 million, 99.5. So 4.5 million people have kind of disappeared from the workforce. And you can look at that number from different angles. You'll see the same picture. And again, why is that? Well, many factors at work, but clearly the COVID shock, the lockdowns, the mask mandates, the vaccination mandates, all kinds of things that really turned society upside down, had a dramatic effect on the labor market. And that also has impacted on supply chains. So I think that's the key kind of, if you say, well, okay, supply and demand are like a pair of scissors. They interact to give you a certain level of inflation or price pressure. So it's again, it's a little bit strange to say, well, it's one or the other. It's sort of both of them. But I think the major culprit is on that supply side, because if you look at the macro data, what you see is that the economy has sort of got back pretty much to where it should be. So, for example, the level of real GDP in the US, it's about 3% above where it was at the end of 2019. Now, you'd normally expect it to be 4.5%, 5%. So it's not quite, back to where it would have been, but it's not, in a sort of a historical or a trend sense. The outlier does not appear to be the level of economic activity. The really prominent and puzzling thing is that at full employment, the economy is missing a lot of workers that were there pre-COVID, and they may or may not come back. And you see this again if getting back to the supply chains popping up. For example, one of the components that has been driving up, it's worth about 4% of the CP index, contributes about 4%, is used car sales. Used car vehicles, the number today, that was up about 23% year on year. New vehicles, more around about 13% or so. But we've had this story in the US in particular of semiconductor shortages. That means that harder to get your hands on a new car. People have been turning to used cars, and that's pushing up temporarily the price of used cars. That's feeding into inflation. So I would lay more of the blame at the feet of the supply side of the economy than the demand side per se, because I think in many ways the central banks and governments have been successful in getting economic activity back and getting these quite strong V-shaped recoveries, which other things equal is good. However, having said that, I do think that central banks have been slow to act. Why do I single out central banks? Because the primary responsibility in the kind of the modern system of macroeconomic policy that is standard across the world is that the central banks are given the main job of controlling inflation. That is, if inflation is too high, they're the ones that governments and the markets and the private sector look to rein in demand. Now, they were very slow. One of the reasons, maybe the principal reason that they were slow, was that they did understand that a lot of the inflation was being driven from the supply side, and typically supply side shocks self-correct. And so central banks often will kind of look through supply side shocks, because they say to themselves, to use the famous word now, the higher inflation should be transient. It should be self-correcting. The problem is when a central banker says transient, or an economist says transient, they may be talking about 1 year, 1.5 years, as gradually these relative price moves, which have driven inflation high, start to unwind and self-correct. You see this with oil prices in particular. Headline inflation will sometimes go up quite a bit, then it will come down again because oil prices go up and then they come down, and that will drive inflation as well. But having said that, I think central banks were far too slow. And even today, we see the ECB has an interest rate. I mean, inflation is running at 7% or so, and yet the ECB is maintaining its policy rate at minus 50 basis points. You heard that correctly. They still have a negative interest rate policy in the euro area. And the ECB is still expanding its balance sheet, which is monetary easing. So you say to yourself, hold on a minute, we've had a fair few months now to figure out that while this may be supply side driven, it's not self-correcting anytime soon. And central banks need to rein in demand. The Fed has started that process already in the last March through May. The Fed has raised its interest rate by 75 basis points. They've essentially told the markets in the next, by July, 2 more meetings, there'll be another 100 basis points, and they're going to keep going beyond that. They're also going to start shrinking their balance sheet in June. But again, I think the Fed was also quite slow to act. Last point I'll make, pardon me, is that while we have this very elevated inflation, and we now have central banks scrambling to catch up, we have this new shock, which is Ukraine and Russia. Now, obviously, a very geopolitical event, and takes the discussion a long way away from pure economics. But Russia and Ukraine, of course, are major suppliers of energy, particularly Russia, food, fertilizers, minerals, rare earths, all sorts of things. And you could not have a worse time or timing for another round of supply shocks, supply side shocks, particularly disruptions to the global supply of key commodities. You could not have envisaged a worse time for all of this to be layered on top of the COVID shock that we are, still operating in the shadow of. So this puts central banks in an even more difficult position. They'll probably have to play catch up even more. And that does run the risk of the R word that you mentioned, Don, that very often where you get a recession is from central banks having to cool down an overheating economy. And because monetary policy works with famously long and varying lags, they may overdo it, and the economy falls into recession, in which case they have to then start tacking back in the other direction. So the next year to two, not just from a geopolitical perspective, not just from an inflation and economic perspective, but from a policy making perspective, is standing to be a very, very challenging one. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, and look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thank you so much. A couple of points to most last few points there. Chairman Powell called it, I think, transitory, and redefined what transitory was, and then stopped using the word. And might have been a chance that they would have been right about that had not the Ukraine war started and the effect on fuel. And
sorry, Don, you're breaking up a little bit there, but that was a question back to me.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, you were breaking up a little bit, but that was a question to me. Yeah, no, I mean, I think if we just forget about Ukraine and Russia, most of this was already happening. The problem with the Russia-Ukraine situation is now, over the next year, the central banks may have been able to, successfully steer inflation slowly back down towards their 2% targets. The Ukraine and Russian situation sets them back dramatically. Yeah. So it's one shock layered on top of another. And that really, again, central banks have to look forward. They have to be forward looking. And when they were thinking in the second half of 2021, how much do they have to do? How soon do they have to do it? They were looking into 2022 and thinking about how it would evolve. At that point, they were not seeing the Russia invasion of Ukraine and all the consequences of that. So it just multiplies the challenge that they have.
Yeah, for sure does. Great. Well, thank you for that.